leaves down into their burrows and devour them. So you put little pieces of paper of different shapes around the burrows, around their openings to their holes, to see what would happen. And we found that the worms, not only would they come out at night and pull the paper down into their holes, but they showed evidence of some intelligence. They felt around the piece of paper and felt its shape. And when they found the pointy end, so for example, triangular down the side, they would take the steepest point of the triangle and pull it down and burrow that way, which is clever. I mean, if you're a worm, it's clever. Because if you try to pull the middle part of the bottom section down, it would get stuck. It would be very difficult to pull that down into your burrow. But by pulling the pointy end down, it's much easier. So they have some intelligence, despite being deaf and apparently impervious to other things. He tested their sense of vibrations. He even tried blowing tobacco smoke on them to see if they would react. So apparently they didn't. So worms don't smoke. I don't know if they drink. I don't know if he tried that actually. You may have, what would happen if you put worm in some beer? Would he get drunk? I think they drown. Anyway, so look at this picture on the bottom left. Darwin realized that if you observe what worms do and how they change the surface of the earth in a small plot, and you extrapolate from that over time and over space, worms are shaping almost the whole surface of the earth. The reason that you see this sort of soft, rounded shape in landscapes is because ragged, I couldn't think of the word I was trying to say. Anyway, ragged shapes of the landscape are gradually rounded and smoothed down by this action of the worms, pulling things down into the earth, molting up, and spitting out their cavities again. And their burrows are also aerating the soil, which is very important for plants and for the roots of plants to help get into the soil, because it's not hard and compacted. In his back garden, Darwin had an experimental stone, which we call nowadays a worm stone. There it is, on the bottom right. It originally had those little metal bars, which are sticking out the hole. Originally had this apparatus attached to them. This is, by the way, not the original worm stone, the reproduction. The original one is lost. In fact, it's probably buried somewhere among worms. But anyway, you put this stone like a donut on the lawn, and these metal bars went down to the bedrock, so they do not move. And that gave him a stable way of measuring what happened to this stone put on the lawn. And he was able to measure the rate at which it gradually sunk. So he was able to prove that things are buried by earthworms, constantly digging out their burrows, spewing out a little bit of soil just a few centimeters at a time, all around the object. And this is kind of a hard concept to understand, but the object is having the earth constantly pushed out from under it and beside it, and so effectively the stone goes out by the action of worms. So you might think this was a very dry and technical volume, but in fact it was an instant hit. It was a bestseller. People loved it. I think it has a lot to do with the fact that Darwin was already really famous by the time the book came out. And so it sold very well. And as usual, he was caricatured. This is one of my favorite Darwin caricatures. It's actually quite a clever one, where you see the artist has represented Darwin in the center there on sort of throne. And here is the word chaos. And the artist has represented his own view or understanding of evolution, and what Darwin has argued that out of chaos, out of nothingness, life has emerged, first with worms, and then we see that sort of gradually evolving into, yes, you get the monkeys as usual, and caveman and finally into a Victorian dandy or gentleman tipping his hat. Thank you very much, Mr. Darwin, for figuring it out. With the caption, "Man is but a worm." Well, but 2 years after that, Darwin finally died. And I hope you understand that the thing I mentioned last week about the deathbed conversion is a complete myth. No deathbed conversion, no taking it all back or anything like that. His family were all around him when he died. He was in a lot of pain. He'd been ill for many years, and his last words, well, there was a couple of them. One of them is, I'm not the least afraid to die. And another time he was retching, vomiting so much, he said, if I could but die, then this would just be over. And so he finally died probably of a heart attack in 1882. So, the reactions to his death, actually this is quite an appropriate or coincidental time to be discussing the reactions to the death of someone super famous. The obituaries and so forth that erupted from around the world. It was quite amazing. No one had ever seen this kind of outpouring of accounts about Darwin and who he was, what he said, what he'd done, and so forth. These are just a few random quotations that I've chosen to give an impression of the way people conceived him when he, at the end of his life, they perceived him as someone who had changed understanding of the world forever, and had done this more than any other person they could think of, except for perhaps Isaac Newton, who, until this time, had always been considered the most famous scientist, at least in the English-speaking world. Newton was a superstar, a big hero. So, but Darwin competed with him. As you know, he was buried in Westminster Abbey, state funeral and so on. The other thing I find interesting about all these obituaries, and think about this for what we are experiencing now, actually, in the media and so forth, is that, well, it's not quite the same, but when Darwin died, no one had written a biography of him yet. And his own privately written one was not known by anyone except by his own family. So when people started to write the story of this man's life and what he had done, they were not drawing on anyone's book or documentary or any, there could be no common source that could influence all those people. They had actually experienced it themselves. They'd been reading his books and reading reviews of his books and reading reports of his work and debates about his work for decades. And what's interesting to me as a historian is that their accounts of Darwin's life are remarkably consistent. I would have expected more variety and more diversity, because what tends to happen, and in 20 years, see if I'm right about this, is that the biographies of famous people, over time, as they are told and retold, tend to homogenize. They tend to become more alike over time, because they are all drawing on common sources, say, previous books. So let's say there's been 3 biographies of Darwin, and somebody writes a new one, and they've read all those 3, and their book will look like that. Then it will be the same for the next book, and the next book, and the next book. So they tend to get more similar. And also what happens is that they evolve. And this is true of all famous people, that there's life story, as it is told and retold over time, evolves, changes. In fact, I was just listening to a BBC podcast about Steve Jobs, and they made that remark that the biographies that were coming out about him, one was seeing that the way his life story is told is evolving. So this will always happen. It always has happened. Wallace himself had one of the final words. He said, Darwin was the philosopher who has wrought a greater revolution in human thought within a quarter of a century than any man of our time, or perhaps of any time. He has given us new conceptions of the world of life and a theory which is itself a powerful instrument of research. has shown us how to combine into one consistent whole the facts accumulated by the separate classes of workers, and has thereby revolutionized the whole study of nature. What he means by the separate classes of workers, he means people from different fields, different subject areas, like geology, paleontology, embryology, and so forth, zoology, botany, and so forth. So then the statues and the memorials and so forth began to appear from the time Darwin died. So this statue was unveiled at the Natural History Museum in 1885, which, by the way, at some later date, this statue was removed. Oh, I don't have a picture for you, but when you enter the Grand Hall, the opening of the Natural History Museum in London, there's the big dinosaur there. But there's a staircase straight ahead of you, which then branches off right and left to go upstairs. At the top of that staircase is the site you're looking at here. So Darwin was sort of the central object on view, apart from whatever animal was in the hall. It wasn't originally the dinosaur that's there now. Dippy, we call him. Anyway, but Darwin was later displaced. And you'll never guess by whom. His old nemesis, Richard Owen, Darwin's big enemy. The only man we know Darwin hated because he was so dishonest and so nasty and so arrogant. Owen, however, was on his own terms a very great scientist. He was considered to be the British Cuvier, and he was the founding director of the Natural History Museum, which was a great victory to have this museum built, because until that time, science in Britain was extremely underfunded, and it was just an amateurish hobby of rich men mostly. So finally there was this national institution. Previously there was the British Museum, and the scientific stuff was just in there with other kinds of objects like mummies and art objects and so forth. So they separated out, and a dedicated museum to natural history was created, and Owen was at the forefront of this project. So after Owen died, I can't remember when he died. Anyway, Owen, he outlived Darwin. Owen's statue replaced Darwin there at the front, which Owen was loved at, to kick Darwin out, to take the center stage in his own museum. And thus it remained for many years. And Darwin's statue, and there was one of Huxley and someone else, they were in the tea shop around the back of these stairs. Not very prestigious. Oh well. But in 2009, when the Darwin bicentenary occurred, and there were so many Darwin commemorations, and it was a year of utter madness for anyone who works on Darwin, particularly me. I gave, I think, 50 public talks in 13 countries. Anyway, there were thousands of events all around the world, so lots of fuss about Darwin in that year. And so they decided to move poor Owen out and put Darwin back. It was on the news, Darwin restored. He's back there where his pictures there. But you see, the way people treat their scientific heroes tells you something, or the way they don't treat them. So there you go. Now, let's move on to some other topics. We're going to be talking about heredity. Yes, this is Francis Galton, who was Darwin's cousin, in fact. And he was, so I've gone back in time now. We're back in Darwin's lifetime, but because it's a different topic. Galton remember the theory of pangenesis that I outlined in the lecture on Darwin's book, The Variation of Plants and Animals and the Rest. It's the Descent of Man lecture. And Darwin had his own theory of heredity called pangenesis, with these little thingies that circulated around your body and are given off in your reproductive cells, these gemmules, you call them. Well, Galton set out to study this theory, to test it, and you'll be delighted to hear that he used bunnies because they're cute. No, I don't know if he did that because they're cute, but anyway, they are cute. So I had to give you a picture of it. He transfused the blood from one bunny to another. So it doesn't kill them, it's just a blood transfusion. So imagine you've got black bunnies and brown bunnies, or whatever, okay, different kinds of bunnies. And you know that if you breed them, the brown bunnies make baby brown bunnies, and so forth, okay? The heredity passes on in the way that everyone understands. But if Darwin's gemmules are responsible for passing the heredity on, he thought, what if I take the blood out of a brown bunny and put it in black bunnies, and then they have babies? Will there be any brown ones? If so, that would demonstrate that Darwin's gemmules exist, and that heredity works the way he hypothesized. Well, can you guess what happened? Nothing, except for lots of bunnies with sore arms, I suppose. But they did not acquire any of the characteristics of the one they got the blood from. So Galton wrote some papers against Darwin's theory, saying this is not true, it doesn't work, and Darwin was wrong about this point. And Darwin objected in an article saying, I never said that the gemmules circulate in the blood. Which is true, he didn't actually say that. He just said they circulate they have. And he said, of course they can't circulate in the blood. I never would have suggested this, because many living things don't even have blood, like plants and simple organisms that do not have blood. He believed that they would also have these gemmules. So the fight went on, but as I mentioned before, the pangenesis theory was not doing very well, and nobody liked it. Even Darwin sort of only half liked it. He knew that he was going out on a limb, and so it didn't make any converts that I know of. But anyway, the other important thing that Galton did was his pioneering work in the statistical methods to study heredity. And his statistical methods would later be part of the founding of genetics, the field of genetics as we know it. Also, the work of this man, the German naturalist August Weismann. He developed what he called germ plasm theory at the end of the 19th century. I love these names: gemmules, pangenesis, germ plasm. The germ plasm theory was that whatever it is that gets passed on to offspring isn't in the body cells, because those get changed, and he believed there was no evidence that anything gets passed on when you change the body of an animal. Those changes don't get passed on. And remember, this has been argued for and against for generations. And most people, including Darwin, just assumed that a lot of stuff is passed on that way. Like the stereotypical example is the blacksmith with a massive bicep pounding metal all day with his hand. Massive bicep will get passed on to his son. What the change that his body requirements will be passed on. So Weismann even experimented with chopping the tails off mice for 20 generations. And guess what? They kept having babies with tails. So even though you would say that this was a very severe selection pressure against tails in this environment, they were not born, new mice were not born after all this time with no tails, or with short tails. Even others think that this experiment wouldn't even be necessary, because the Hebrews, the Jews, had been circumcising their boys for over 2,000 years. And they still have to do it with every new generation, every new boy is born. They still have foreskins, even though they're cut off every generation for thousands of years. That doesn't become hereditary. So, Weismann believed that the hereditary properties of an organism were only present in the reproductive cells, in the, say, eggs and sperm. and they weren't in the rest of the cells. So it didn't matter. So whatever happened to the rest of the body just didn't get passed on. Only those special cells did. So the inheritance of acquired characteristics was well and truly dead, and has been famously dead ever since. This is one of the things that your biology textbook will probably relish in telling you isn't true. And nowadays, and since about, I would say, 1900 or so, since the beginning of the 20th century, it has been called Lamarckism, the inheritance of acquired characteristics. I hope I have disabused you of that name. Don't call it that, because it's a very, very bad name. It's silly. It's wrong, 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 wrong. It's not invented by Lamarck. It was not central to his theory, and almost everybody believed in it anyway, including Darwin. So calling it Lamarckism is completely silly. It's just another one of these historical mistakes. But if you encounter the word and you're reading anywhere, you'll know what the person means by it. What they mean the inheritance of acquired characteristics. But anyway, you can see the direction things are going with the study of the niche of heredity and how it works. So now we come up another character, another big name person in the story, Gregor Mendel, after whom Mendelism and Mendelian, these words are named. He was, as you can see from the photograph I've included there, he was a Catholic monk. And as always, I'm trying to stress the frequent absence of a conflict between science and religion in the history of science. And in this particular case, it's a very good example, because he was not just a monk, but he may even have gone into the church as a way of doing science, because the church funded his scientific education. And as a monk, he carried out his experiments on hybridity, plant breeding experiments. So, I have amended the syllabus recently. Maybe this morning, I can't remember. Memory is appalling. Anyway, check out the syllabus, because I've added a reading for this week, specifically for this lecture. It's a chapter in a book about Mendel. Read it. It is important that you know what this chapter says, because, and I myself have had to change what I've been saying about Mendel, because I was also repeating myths about Mendel, because almost I can guarantee that whatever you've ever heard about Mendel before in your textbooks in the past is wrong. Yet again, complete myths, utterly wrong. And this book chapter will explain to you why what is always said about Mendel as the founder of genetics and so forth is not true. He didn't do what the textbooks say he did. He was not a Mendelian. Mendel was not a Mendelian. So, if you want to check your textbooks, it's not underlined. They're wrong. As usual, it's much more complicated. Mendel was performing experiments really to try and demonstrate, another way in which species could originate, and that was by hybridism. Remember what a hybrid is? When you take two species and mix them together, and the offspring is not one species or the other, it's some third thing. That's called a hybrid. Remember, the horse and the donkey mate, and you get a mule. A mule is a hybrid, and plants particularly. Loads of hybrids. Some of the most famous examples might be orchids. They're always making new orchids by hybridization, mixing different ones and mix. Okay, so Mendel was trying to study this topic and was actually hoping that his experiments would demonstrate an alternative way in which species come about. So he conducted experiments on thousands and thousands of pea plants. And these pea plants had a few basic differences, like purple flowers or white flowers, round peas versus wrinkled peas, green and yellow, you can see this on the slide. And so by mixing them, he was trying to see what would happen when you specifically record specific traits, pair the parents, and then record statistically in that Galtonian way what the offspring are like. Well, this did indirectly reveal something about how inheritance works, but that wasn't actually what Mendel was after. He wasn't trying to found genetics. But this is what he found, or this is what people say he found. And on such shaky ground here, I'm afraid that making another mistake about Mendel. But this is what he is famous for supposedly saying, supposedly showing in his paper in the mid-1860s, that, okay, look at the very top of the diagram. You've got a red and a white parent.
I remember this.
And he hypothesizes that they've got hereditary bits in them. See, so you've got those circles underneath the stars of the hereditary information contained in each one. So you cross them together and you get to row 2, where you've got 4 offspring, which are all red, even though you mixed white and red. But then, in the 3rd generation, that's number 3, he got 3 red and 1 white. Well, where did the white come from? The parents were all red. This showed that something had passed through the 2nd generation from the 1st. The property of white was in there, within the 2nd generation, but just not visible. And in fact, the fact that it came out of this ratio of 3 to 1 demonstrated that one characteristic was dominant over another, that is, it would be expressed more often, and that the hereditary information must be paired, and that it's split in the reproductive cells. So these, I've now put Mendel's 2 laws in quotation marks, because apparently these aren't actually Mendel's laws after all, even though every textbook will tell you that they are. So I now provide this slide for your information only, but I will not discuss it. Okay, so the main point eventually that came out of Mendel's work, or at least that people thought came out of Mendel's work, whichever one it is, was that heredity is particulate. It was not the blending process that Fleming-Jenkin had objected to Darwin's theory. Remember, with saying that everything would just blend together, mix 50-50, and any new characteristics would be blurred away, like when you pour some, say, pour a cup full of black paint into a huge bucket of white paint and stir it up long enough, it's just going to be white, because it will be blended away with so much of the other material. Well, that turns out not to be the case. And yes, as you can see, explaining simple rules and ratios. Next myth is, and this one is why we care about this, but it's always repeated again and again, that if only Darwin had read Mendel's paper, then the Mendelian revolution and modern genetics would have started right then, instead of decades later. No, rubbish. The other myth that correlates with this one is that Darwin had a copy of Mendel's paper on his desk when he died, but never managed to read it. Again, nope, he didn't. In fact, he had a scientific journal in his massive library. In one article, in one of those journals, there was a footnote that mentioned Mendel's paper. Big deal! It means nothing. Darwin never heard of Mendel. They never met. And this is the important part. If Darwin had read Mendel's paper, he would have been unimpressed. He would have learned nothing. Darwin himself had conducted extensive hybridization experiments. He had also had results, he had also had this 3-to-1 ratio result in some of his breeding experiments. but didn't appreciate the significance because his thinking and the direction of his research was entirely different. And Darwin was not mathematically minded at all. He was that was not the kind of scientist that he was. He was someone who observed living things, didn't think very much in terms of numbers. So no, it wouldn't have made any difference anyway. So Mendel, the way this story is told, and the way I started at the beginning of the lecture, I said that people's biographies and lives change a lot. Mendel is an excellent example. Just like Wallace, an example of someone's life who, in subsequent decades, has completely transformed into this legendary character who never existed. Mendel is the great overlooked genius, according to legend, right? Who discovers modern genetics, and everyone else is too blind and stupid and ignorant to appreciate his work, and it is ignored, and his article is just left to collect dust for decades. That's the way people tell the story. And many of you probably heard that before. Let's start with a break. At this point, 5 minutes. I want to mention a couple of things about Mendel and why he was not the genetics revolutionary that he is. Because you have to remember that Mendel worked on peas, and his conclusions about how heredity works in peas was, pay attention, about peas. It wasn't about anything else. It wasn't about how the heredity, later to be called the genetics, of living things works. No one knew that it was generalizable. That wasn't apparent. So this is another reason why we shouldn't think that it was inexplicably tragic and stupid that people overlooked the significance of his work, because this is just a much more exciting, romantic way of telling the story. No, people took it exactly the way it was. Oh, there's a boring paper about pea hybrids. Which it is, by the way, if you haven't read it, especially in the original German. Oh god, it's dire. Anyway, but enough of that. So, anyway, but other workers were working more and more on the mechanics of how heredity works in living things and how things are passed on. From Galton to Weizmann, and then to the Dutch scientist Hugo de Vries. So in 1889, he postulated that inheritance of specific traits in organisms comes in particles, which he called, after Darwin's theory, pangenes. The pan later got dropped, and now we call them genes. In other words, that the inheritance is in little things in organisms called genes, which I know you've all heard of thousands of times. So in 1900, and this is a very complicated story which I don't fully understand, but Mendel's paper was rediscovered by 2 or 3 people in the same year. And people still argue about whether or not they were trying to hide his work and take the credit for discovering something new. But in any case, their work, I think the best way of describing it is that it converged with the kind of work that Mendel had been doing on heredity in living things. So these 3 chaps are credited with founding modern genetics, but their findings about the particulate nature of inheritance, about the ratios that show that the hereditary material split into 2 things and was passed on, was overlapped with Mendel's work so much that they named their new work after Mendel, and that's why it's called Mendelian genetics today. Rather than, as I'm sure they would have secretly wished it be named after one of them, because come on, everybody wants to have something big and famous named after themselves, but it's not to be. So we have then the advent, the beginning of a new biological theory, which was called mutation theory. The De Vries had found new forms of primroses, and there they are on the top right, appearing. Right? These were not hybrids. They were a new form of plant that just appeared by itself in one go. It's a bit like, if you remember back to the lecture of Wallace, or Wallace believed that new varieties were born at once from, say, normal colored parents, say black beetles will occasionally give birth to gray or white or green ones at once. Well, this is the same phenomenon that De Vries had found with these primroses. And he called this dramatic change that just appears in one offspring a mutation. And this formed the basis of a new theory which, for many years, some people, particularly these laboratory-based geneticists, who were big into maths, unlike Darwin and his descendants, who mostly worked in the field and studied living things rather than in the laboratory. These laboratory people thought that they had topped Darwin. They had the new theory of evolution, and Darwin's was outmoded. It's not natural selection, they argued, it's by mutations. That's where new species come from. And I find it very similar to Wallace, but nobody seems to have remembered Wallace's early essay. So, by combining this with Galton's statistics, they thought they had a new theory that new species just appeared at once, and that Darwin's natural selection was only a process that could prune away or kill off forms that don't work so well. But they argued, wrongly as it turns out, that natural selection could not generate new novelty, it could not generate new forms. They thought that things only came about through genetic mutations, which was the process they themselves studied. So this shouldn't surprise anyone that people think that their field is the most important field. Everyone thinks that, and usually exaggerates their finding. Okay, so then in 1903, these fellows, whose names you don't need to remember, suggested that a part of a cell called the chromosome, they observed through these very careful microscopic observations and these drawings that these parts separate or segregate or split into two before something reproduces. And they thought, aha, these chromosomes are doing what genes are. We know experimentally that genes must be doing this. Now we've observed a part of the cell that does that. So the genes must be in there, they argue. They must be in the chromosomes because they split in the way that is experimentally already understood from the offspring. Right, then we come to the American naturalist Thomas Hunt Morgan. And he wanted to prove this mutation theory was the alternative to Darwinism. He was able to show that the genes are indeed on the chromosomes. And he combined Mendel's theory with this chromosome theory of inheritance. Actually, I've already summarized this slide a second ago. But it turned out that this fight between the geneticists and the Darwinians was a bit of a waste of time. The geneticists had overplayed or exaggerated the significance of mutations. It turned out that mutations were not new species. They were just, in fact, they were the source of many of the little differences that Darwinian natural selection chooses to shape organisms to new environments. So rather than being an alternative to Darwinism, it was found to be a part of a picture that was unknown to Darwin and his contemporaries. So from around 1936 to say 47, Mendelism and Darwinism were combined, and many people call that the modern synthesis. Sorry, I didn't write down the slide, but you can catch my words. Like the modern synthesis between these two fields of study. So they were not incompatible after all, but complementary. And as a consequence of this, Darwin became more famous again, because his name was again attached to this. Many people would use the phrase neo-Darwinian. From this point on, but we don't want to fuss about nomenclature. Okay, then in 1953, Watson and Crick discovered the actual structure of the DNA molecule, seen here in this very famous photograph, they published in 1953, their discovery in 1953, and from that point on, things have, well, as you know, modern genetics has just exploded, and it's still steamrolling on faster and faster and faster, and becoming more and more specialized. So specialized, in fact, that I think, this is my opinion, that many modern biologists, microbiologists, are so specialized in their understanding of the microstructures of cells and how the molecules work and so forth, that they've lost their understanding of the big picture. Many of these microbiologists I have spoken to don't really understand evolution, because this is a consequence of specialization. I don't understand their genetics either, but they've lost the big picture. This is inevitable in many fields where the field diversifies into ever more areas of specialization. But we won't go any further than Watson and Crick in this course. Okay, another topic today. This is topic 3. Draw a line, notes. Age of the Earth, yet again. Now, near the end of Darwin's life, there was a challenge made to Darwinism by a physicist now known as Lord Kelvin, who calculated that the Earth couldn't be nearly as old as Darwin and the geologists believed, because if it had started off as a molten sphere, it must, in order for it to have cooled to the temperature it is now, it must be, I forget the age he estimated actually, but it was not very old. I must say maybe 10 million years or something like that, but a tiny fraction of what the Darwin geologists of previous eras believed it to be. And so he said, there has not been enough time. The Earth is too young for life to evolve by this unbelievably slow, gradual process that Darwin has put forward. Darwin knew this had to be wrong, but physicists had such status and clout that this was seen by many people as a very serious body blow to Darwinism. That, well, physicists are really clever, they can't be wrong. The only way Kelvin could be wrong was if there was some other source for heat in the Earth. And indeed, there is, which he didn't know about. But it was revealed in the work by Ernest Rutherford, a scientist from New Zealand, but working in Cambridge. Radioactivity is a source of heat in the center of the Earth that Kelvin did not know about, thus rendering his calculations completely irrelevant, because there is a source of heat generated in the center of the Earth. It isn't just something that was started hot and has just been cooling off ever since. It's making its own heat. So Rutherford, by using what is called radiometric dating, that is the rate in which things radioactively decay, could, for the first time, date rocks. Now, all the way back to the first lecture in this module, we've been talking about how people uncovered the fact that the Earth was super old, unbelievably ancient, but they had no idea how ancient. Just countless millions of years must have transpired before that was obvious from the rocks. But people who made guesses about the years were just making it up. I mean, it's how many millions of years did it take to deposit this strata, and then that one, and then that one, and this thicker one, and that thinner one. And nobody knew any of the numbers. So how can you add up a whole bunch of unknown numbers to get a total? You can't. So people in Darwin's era, the geologists and Darwin himself, didn't give dates. They did not estimate how old the Earth was. They had no way of knowing. At the turn of the century, it became possible for the first time to actually see how old a rock is. And so I've got two little video clips here for you. No sound, right?
As time passed, radioactive decay was gradually turning the uranium into lead, changing the chemical composition of the rock. This inexorable process begins the moment a rock forms and new minerals crystallize within it. Rutherford suggested that by carefully measuring the chemistry of these minerals, scientists should be able to tell how long ago the rock had formed. So, after 200 years of controversy and speculation, the age of the Earth would be found in a few grains of dust.
There's a story that when Rutherford was working in Canada, he went up to a colleague one day with a sample of rock. "How old do you think this is?" he inquired. "Oh, about 10 million years," was the reply. "I can prove to you," said Rutherford with glee, "that this rock is more than 500 million years old." And that was far older than current estimates of the age of the Earth. And it is indeed remarkable how, as radioactive dating techniques developed, how quickly scientists' estimate of geological time and the age of the Earth expanded.
Okay, and clip number 2.
This rather inconspicuous looking object, it's part of a meteorite which fell in Mexico at a place called Allende in February 1969. And it is actually the oldest known object that we know of that exists on Earth. It's the oldest object that can be held by human hands.
I just give it 2 elements.
It has an age of 4,566 plus or minus 2 million years. Actually, most meteorites that hit the Earth are only just slightly younger.
They're all within quite a
narrow stretch, around about 4,550 million years. And this is regarded as part of the material from which the solar system, our sun and planets, actually came together, accreted. They are the remnants of the raw material from which the solar system is made.
So that means that by being able to date rocks, geologists were able to shore up what they had been working on for hundreds of years, and to actually date all those different eras. To date how old were the rocks that contain the non-avian dinosaurs. Of course, you know they're not all extinct, but and to date all the others, and then to date rocks that are even not from this Earth, like meteorites that fall to the ground, to date those. And so the significance of that finding was that the oldest rocks that have ever been found are from space. They are older than the Earth itself, because the Earth was molten, and that means when rocks are melted, when they're molten, their clock resets. So it's only after a rock forms that this process of decay that is detectable begins. So this next topic about the changing shape of the Earth's surface that I'll address next explains the old mystery of the Wallace line. Right here in Southeast Asia, this is Wallace's map. Remember the Wallace line with the living things on the left are Asian families of animals, and on the right are Australian kinds. And in Wallace's day, they knew that the surface of the Earth sometimes goes up and down, and has done so sometimes repeatedly. Remember the temple, the picture of the temple, the front of Lyell's book, which proved that the Earth had gone down and up again in that part of Italy. So Wallace thought that that had happened here, that maybe two great continents that originally had their own kinds of living things evolved on them, but these continents had sunk, and only the bits that were still above water are the islands of Southeast Asia and Australia. But that doesn't explain things like this. This is one of the other big puzzles that people like Darwin and Wallace study, which is the distribution of living things. And there are some weird puzzles about why are some things distributed around the world in the way they are. For example, there are many examples, marsupials. Now you all think probably, naturally, rightly, of Australia. If someone says marsupial, think kangaroo and all those other cute little hoppy things, right? They are very strictly Australian and in some of the islands around there. But they also exist in South America and just a tiny bit of North America. Why are they so widely separated? Well, that's what I'm getting to. Things that are related are otherwise always right next to each other. That's why the Wallace line is puzzling. Because here you've got things right next to each other that aren't closely related, but they should be. And so, the thing that was missing, that Wallace and Darwin and his contemporaries couldn't understand, is that the surface of the Earth could not just go up and down, but side to side, and that the continents have moved. That was just unimaginable for the Victorians. No one ever thought of this. It just was, how on earth can the continents move? And they're just solid rock. They're there forever. They move around, but only up and down. Well, the first person to seriously put this forward was a German meteorologist named Alfred Wegener. Meteorologist. There he is with a very nice-looking pipe. And he argued that the reason the continents, the shapes of the continents appear to fit together like a jigsaw puzzle, which of course has been, people have noticed this for centuries, ever since that we had a map of the world that was at all reliable, that the shape of South America seems to fit into this shape of Africa, and this part of Africa seems to fit into this gap here and so forth. He argued the reason that they look like that is that they used to be together, and that the continents have drifted apart. Now, that's just part of his argument. It's not just the shapes of the land masses that suggest that they used to be together, but if you actually examine the rock themselves, the rocks, say, on either side, say here in South Africa, and in the corresponding part of South America, it is the same geological formation. The same rock with the same fossils in it. That's very good evidence. Then there were all those other puzzles, like that go all the way back to the beginning of our story. Why was it that people found tropical species in Britain? Why, when they dug down to the layers of the where coal was found and so forth, they would find remnants of palm fronds and so forth, they were fossilized. What were they doing there? They thought, well, maybe the Earth used to be really hot. It used to be tropical in Britain. Wegener used this kind of fossil evidence to argue that parts of the tropics have drifted off to other climates. That's why you find tropical species in temperate zones. So the way Wegener's story is always told, I think, is maybe a little bit legendary too, because it's always told this way, that his case that the continents drift around throughout the age of the Earth was not accepted, and he was ridiculed. That's true. He made almost no converse. He was widely ridiculed as a fool. And then the explanation in your textbooks will always say, because he did not provide a mechanism whereby the continents can move. And therefore, geologists and so forth were justified in ridiculing him and not accepting his theory. I don't buy that. I don't buy that at all. That, I think, is the kind of explanation that people give later because it makes them sound better. Well, we weren't. Yeah, well, one reason that's very plausible is that because he's a meteorologist, he's not a geologist. That's one reason why people will often not take you seriously. But I hope you will learn the lesson from the history of science that often the biggest discoveries are made from people on the edge or even outside of a field, because they're not full of the dogma and orthodoxy that is pumped into your brains in university to make you talk the talk and walk the walk of whatever field it is you're studying. And I guarantee you are. You will all know all the detailed jargon and so forth of whatever field that you're studying. And that's necessary. You have to know it. But if you are too much of an insider, then you're not able to see whatever gaps or mistakes or inconsistencies might exist in your field. But someone who's sort of straddling it, who is competent to understand that field, but is seeing it from the outside, they often see things that the insiders miss, and they often make the biggest discoveries. That's something I often observe. And Wegener is one of those types. He could see what the experts couldn't. Anyway, he was ridiculed. And alas, he died after arguing vigorously and writing some books on his theory of continental drift. He died on an expedition to Greenland on the ice shelf, and you remember where Greenland is, right? It's that big white. Greenland is the white land. It's that big icy island up in the north. And he was buried there in the field during this expedition, and it's kind of ironic that Wegener, who argued so vigorously that the surface of the Earth is slowly moving, that he himself is slowly moving in the glacier, because of course the glacier on the surface of Greenland is moving. So he is moving at tectonic speed right now. He is drifting. The founder of continental drift is drifting, and I imagine he's also perfectly preserved because he's been frozen since 1930. So, next big revolution in science happens after Wegener's death, but it vindicated what he had argued for so unsuccessfully, and it's called plate tectonics. And there are a number of discoveries here that demonstrated that the surface of the Earth really does move, and it's moving right now. The surface of the Earth moves, just very, very slowly, and about the rate at which your fingernails grow. That is about how fast the continents are moving around. So it's really slow, and of course that's why we took so long to figure it out. But this discovery took a number of converging observations and evidence that are quite, I'll have to explain them to you, but that they all converge on the same explanation. So first of all, in fact I've got one of them on here, 3 video clips for you. Start the first one.
Ocean ridge would be symmetrical. So
Yes, sorry, I forgot what that clip was. Okay, first thing was that after the Second World War, with the Cold War beginning, the navies, especially the United States, were mapping the seafloor in order to find out exactly what are the contours of the ocean floor. You know, it's not just a sandy beach down there from one coast to the other. There are features in which submarines or listening devices or bombs could be hidden from sonar and so forth. So they wanted to map. So they were mapping the floor of the oceans. And one of the things, they allowed geologists sometimes to go along on these ships and conduct their own research. And one of the things they did was to drag a magnetometer, which is basically just a magnet detector, behind the ship, which could read the way that the rocks on the floor of the ocean were magnetized, because the magnetic pole of the Earth has switched many times in the history of this planet, and I don't think anybody yet knows why, but north and south occasionally go whoop, and the compass would go and point the other way. I don't know why, maybe somebody knows, but it's happened many, many times. What that means is, if you have rock from one era, when magnetic north was in the north, and then you say you have some other rocks over here that were from a different era, when the magnetic compass is pointing the other way, when you put your magnetometer on them, they would be, the magnetized particles in them will be pointing in the direction of the North Pole when they solidify from lava, from magma. Okay, do you follow this? Okay, so when they drag their magnetometers over the ocean, they found these stripes where it was magnetized one way, another way, this way, that way, over and over again. They look a bit like zebra stripes. And then they found, this was the spooky part, that the stripes were symmetrical on either side of this mountain ridge in the center of the Atlantic. How could the stripes match on either side? What's going on there? And that led to the discovery that the seafloor is spreading, because out of that mountain ridge in the center of the Atlantic, new rock is forming and coming out of the center. That's what this graphic here illustrates. New rock is coming up and then spreading out over the surface of the ocean, and hence locking in the magnetic compass at the time that it emerges. And as the Earth's magnetic compass keeps switching, these stripes of magnetic stripes are spread across. And the continents, which are on either end, are being pushed apart by the same process.
Look carefully at the pattern of magnetism that had been found in the rocks of the Pacific Ocean.
The other remarkable thing was it was a little later when we realised this survey, which had been in the literature for several years, does in fact exhibit a symmetry.
Okay, that point was made.
60s, scientists have worked out that beneath the crust, the entire surface of the planet is divided up into a small number of pieces, plates. These plates are all slowly moving, carrying the continents with them. The theory that described this motion was called plate tectonics. It was the biggest step forward scientists had ever made in understanding the Earth. Everything then referred to Earth. But there was something missing. They knew the plates were moving, but scientists had no idea why they were moving. The question is particularly pressure and temperature. Nobody was more worried about this problem than one of the architects of the theory, Dan Mackenzie.
By the beginning of the 70s, we had some understanding of what was going on the surface, because we'd been able to map the motions of the plates really in quite some detail all over the world. But what we really didn't have at that stage was any decent understanding of how these motions were maintained.
Which is the cue to the next clip.
Spreads in two directions and goes sideways. It begins to lose heat. Eventually, the much cooler rock sinks back down. Through this...
Okay, pausing. This is what I just described to you about how at the mid-Atlantic ridge there is a mountain chain, which is that line in the center. out of which new rock is emerging from deep inside the Earth. And the process of that new rock forming is pushing the crust of the Earth apart on either side, which is what you see in this graphic. And in some places, the plates, which are the continents or the land masses on the surface that we can see, they are essentially like a crust floating on liquid. They're very thin compared to the Earth itself. Indeed, according to the mantle of the Earth. There are different kinds of junctures where these plates come together. Sometimes they sit side by side and rub sideways towards each other. I believe the San Andreas Fault in California is like that, and that is how earthquakes occur. The plates get a little bit stuck because nobody has been avoiding them. So they're stuck. And every once in a while, the pressure builds up enough that they slip a bit, and that's an earthquake, which we don't really get here, do we? Yeah. So if you actually watch these graphics and always look out for where Singapore is, we're a very stable place. We're in the center of a plate, only over for the poor Indonesians in Java and Sumatra and so forth. They're full of volcanoes. They are right on the plate, so they're going to have eruptions and earthquakes forever, as they always have. Right? Remember the big tsunami in, what was that, 2004? And there's been eruptions since then. We're really safe. Singapore's just going to sit here and not move. I'm not making any kind of point about that. I'm just saying geologically, this is going to be a very stable place and going to be here forever. But some of the other joints between plates are depicted in this graphic, where one plate goes underneath another. That's called a subduction zone. Okay, we'll play this together.
The spreading process, the Earth's crust is very slowly dragged apart. And it is this that ultimately makes the continents move. So what in my youth was no more than a speculative theory is now fully accepted. Continents do drift. The Indian subcontinent has moved north, pushing up the sediments that had accumulated on the sea floor ahead of it to form the Himalayas. Which is how my fossilized seashell came to rest in mountains over 2 miles high.
Right, so the old mystery that people have wondered about for centuries, how do you get fossil seashells at the tops of mountains and so forth? This is one of the ways that happens. I was on an expedition to make a documentary on Wallace a couple of years ago, and we went to Timor, East Timor, which is an island between Australia and here, close to Australia. And with us was a local geologist, he was an Irish geologist, but he was based in Timor, working for the oil industry. But anyway, he took us out to the field and showed us the hillsides and so forth, and the cliffs, and I've never seen rocks like this. They were so many different colors and bands, were totally mixed up in this incredible confusion, like you had taken different colors of cream or toothpaste and mixed them all up. It just was a mess. And he said, this is just like what you saw there for the Himalayas. This is part of what was once under the ocean. This is rock that was underneath the ocean bed. And as Australia and its plate have been moving up towards Indonesia, it's sort of plowed bits of the rock from under the sea, and sometimes these piles have come up and out into the air in our islands. And Timor is one of those. And that's why these rocks are so unbelievably twisted and mangled, because of the pressure they've undergone, having an entire continent plow into them and push them across the bottom of the ocean, eventually crunched up into the air. Timor is one of the places Wallace visited. He noted that its flora and fauna was quite similar to Australia, but it was a deep ocean island. Obviously, it's never actually been connected with Australia. So how did the Australian things get there? Well, random acts of natural transportation and so forth. So it turns out that because Darwin and Wallace and all those other naturalists of their generation, one of the main things they were trying to do was to figure out what happened in the history of the Earth. How did it get like this? We've got all these old things, all these fossils and rocks, but it's really complicated. What has the story been? How has it unfolded? That was what they were trying to figure out. Right? There were things that once lived here that are gone, like those giant megatheriums and things that Darwin discovered in South America. There are these weird distributions of how things are around the world, right? With things on islands and continents usually resembling each other, but not always. There's the marsupial spread on apart. So by Darwin's story being put together with that of continental drift or plate tectonics, the movement of the Earth's surface, the forging and destroying of uncrossable boundaries is why the distribution of plants and animals on Earth is so complex today. When things are separated for a long time, they evolve independently and become more different. Say in India, for example. India was this massive island on its own for a long time. I had never seen a documentary about ancient wildlife on India, but I can guarantee you that it was unique because it was a continent on its own for a really long time. And then what happened? It crunched into Asia. And it still is. It's still crunching. The Himalayas are still growing taller right now at that very rate. But what would have happened? That unique flora and fauna that lived in India suddenly in contact with other things. Probably cross-migrated. Probably loads of things in that old India went extinct. This is, you can simply predict this by understanding how the process works. The same was the case with South America. Remember, Darwin found all those amazing extinct giant things that had lived in South America, and he had pondered, what happened to them? The environment he can see no evidence of a great catastrophe in the rocks. It seemed to have had a stable history. Why were these amazing animals gone? Where did they go? Well, like his macrochelia, remember the long neck of Patagonia and so forth. What happened to them was, they were on a continent on their own too. South America was on its own after Australia took off, and Antarctica and Australia left. And there was South America on its own. Evolved all sorts of amazing, unique things that lived nowhere else. But eventually, it crunched into North America, as it is now. You know, running into North America. Ooh, big mistake. What happened? All sorts of things migrated down from North America, which has been more connected with the rest of the world, I believe, down to the south and ate everything they found. They killed them all off. Massive, massive extinction event. As new predators, such as the saber-toothed cat, big fangs, went down there and just chowed down on all those cute little giant things that Darwin later found. Killed them all, because they had no defense. Remember, the most dangerous predator in that ancient South America was a bird. Remember, I think I told you, a terror bird. It's like a giant killer ostrich, which, okay, could kill you or me, but not a saber-toothed cat. The cat could kill the bird. And also the other things. And then, of course, millions of years later, the nastiest predator of them all, at least if we're talking about large animals, human beings, came down from the north and killed off the last ones. That's why the last megatherium probably died out only, well, within a few thousand years ago. And some of their remains have been found that looked sadly very fresh. We only just missed them. So if one could bring Darwin and Wallace back to life and tell them, I think one of the things that they would be most curious to know would be this story about the discovery of plate tectonics and the fact that the surface of the Earth has moved around. Because this would have answered many of the things that they couldn't understand. and would have explained so many of the puzzles that they struggled with to reconstruct how life on Earth has unfolded and why. Because the Earth itself is moving around. Okay, that's it for today.
Det mest bare det står da.